Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
So we are with Romedi, and my name is Grace. We are from Switzerland and a law firm there called MME. And we're here to explain something that's not related to Switzerland, but actually Europe and the whole regulatory circus with MiCA, DORA, and a lot of acronyms for regulations that cause a couple of headaches since now over a year.
And yeah, our goal is to give you some DeFi survival tactics. So, first question is, when should you actually care about the EU? I mean, we're here in the US. You might have your US company or in the Bahamas, in the Cayman or wherever set up, so why should you even care about the EU? But there are two reasons or two incidents when you have to care about the EU. One is if your user base is in the EU, if you sell tokens to the EU, if you provide applications to users in the EU. And the second one is if you have partners from traditional finance or centralized finance in the EU.
And in most of these cases, you'd think, because I'm DeFi, I'm transnational, I'm not related to a specific jurisdiction, so I don't need to care. But, as we will see in the next couple of slides, this is not necessarily the case.
Okay, so regarding the user base, the main cases where you have to think about it is if you're offering a protocol, so for example, an application, or on the infrastructure layer, or if you're offering an interface to these protocols, or if you're offering a token. Then you should really look into MiCA and think about, well, am I regulated? And there are actually three requirements that have to be met. One is it has to be a regulated activity. So regulated activities would be like the token sale or the provision of custody services, trading services, and so forth. And they should not be exempt. And the second thing that you have to fulfill is that you have to actively target the European market. There is a thing called reverse solicitation. So if you don't really actively target the market, but clients come to you, then you also don't have to care about MiCA. The thing is, this reverse solicitation, the application of it is very narrow. So first of all, you will not be allowed to go to conferences there, have your KOLs in the European Union, and so forth. And also, if you make use of reverse solicitation, the clients come to you, you're not allowed to offer them additional services. So that narrows down this possibility to avoid MiCA actually quite a lot. And then the last one, yeah, you should, if you're fully decentralized, you will not be subject to MiCA, so that was also a requirement.
So things are not that bad. It's not whatever you do that could make you end up in trouble in the EU. It's just specific things. And as Romedi mentioned, the decentralization part. But as we'll dive into it, it's not because you think you're decentralized that you are decentralized according to the European regulator. Now, the second instance is if you have partners. Like everyone is mentioning this idea of integrating DeFi into other types of projects. So you have integrating the protocol with a centralized service that's DeFi relying on a DeFi stack. Or you could just have the protocol being accessible through an aggregator, or like being embedded with a wallet. You also have this idea of having your token being launched through EU launchpads. You have so many DeFi projects that still have a team that wants to offer a token, and they will, as a team, reach out to a launchpad or just take a listing on the EU trading venue. So all of these scenarios could lead to some EU implications from a regulatory perspective. And then what you need to think about is, especially for the first ones I mentioned, MiCA and DORA could come into play depending on who you integrate with. Because if you are in touch with someone who is itself subject to regulation, this may have some consequences on you, as we'll see afterwards.
And yeah, what is if whatever you're offering is truly DeFi under MiCA, then you see offering the protocol is not a problem, so you don't have specific obligations. Offering an interface, if the interface is decentralized, that's not an issue. And offering a token, if the token offering is decentralized, is also, there are no specific obligations that you have to comply with.
This explains why everyone wants to be decentralized nowadays. It makes life much easier. But then for EU partners, being decentralized may become actually an issue sometimes, because integrating with them may become complicated. You're not really an ICT asset because they don't control you if your DeFi protocol is subject to decentralized governance potentially, or simply immutable and controlled by no one. But you're also not a third-party service provider. A DeFi protocol doesn't have someone who will sign agreements on how the protocol is being used. So there are some limitations on how can these centralized actors or traditional finance actors comply with their requirements under DORA for operational resilience when they're trying to integrate this hybrid, weird structure that doesn't fit into any of the categories. Then also offering the protocol for a centralized gateway. This can be the easy thing. Like if it's just an interface that's aggregating things, they are regulated for their own activities, and then you are fully DeFi, this should be okay. Then offering the token for EU launchpads. Well, if you're offering it for a launchpad, probably there's an entity somewhere in the loop that is handling this process, and there may be obligation for the offering because they are offering it in a centralized manner, although it is related to a DeFi protocol. So it's not because you are DeFi that everything you do will be DeFi at the end. Same for the listing. There's not a community that's getting in touch with a SEX. There will be a team and potentially an agreement that's being signed with a centralized entity. Same again, there will be obligations in the loop.
And the next one, what if it's not DeFi? So you have licensing obligations if you are issuing this or providing an application or an infrastructure. You have the licensing obligations regarding the interface. We'll look at that in a second. And you have obligations like white paper issuance, notification for offering the token. And with the interface, that's an important point. So if you offer an interface, for example, which is centralized to something decentralized, so an interface to a DEX, your interface would still be considered centralized, and you could be subject to regulation. Now, in the case of a DEX, it would be that you're not treated as a provider of a trading venue, but more as a transmission. What is it?
Transmission of orders.
Transmission. Yeah.
Maybe just one other fun fact on the licensing requirement. So once you become decentralized, you don't need a license anymore. But this, from a business perspective, doesn't make much sense because it would mean that you start your business, you pay a lot of money to lawyers to get a license under MiCA, but then you fully decentralize 1 year later, and all of this gets thrown away. I'm not sure how many projects are willing to do that, so look maybe for jurisdictions where you can start without a license. Switzerland may be one of them. Now, for EU partners, if you are centralized, well, DORA is there. You need to reach out for it because you'll need to have some contractual arrangements in place with anyone who integrates you as a third-party service provider. And these contractual arrangements are pretty heavy. So for having discussed it with a couple of traditional actors, there's a lot of representation warranties and other things included there just to make sure that they can rely on you because you're supposed to be a 100% reliable ICT service provider. And you will be subject to oversight if ever the part of the service you're providing to them is critical. So this will be even more pressure on you as an ICT service provider. Now, offering the protocol itself, well, for a centralized gateway, nothing changes there. There are no problems. You just offer CeFi instead of DeFi. And then offering the token, exactly the same thing, because obviously centralized entity, so obligations in terms of white paper, marketing, communication, and then same for the listing. So when you think about it, for EU partners, the only thing that changes is if you're DeFi, it may be a bit complicated to figure out how third parties being themselves subject to regulations can integrate you. If you're centralized, it makes things much easier. You just know that you have a bunch of obligations to comply with and someone who may oversee you. Ooh, so now the tough question is, what is actually DeFi under MiCA? So I have mentioned that you may identify as DeFi, but it doesn't mean that you will be DeFi according to national authorities in the EU.
Yeah, and I mean, we have CeFi and we have DeFi, but there is actually a broad spectrum of different shades of DeFi and CeFi. So the CeFi, on one side you would have a CeFi like a centralized exchange. They have your assets and they provide this trading system which they control. And then on the middle, the centralized DeFi, the CDFi, you would have actually also certain aspects that are decentralized, like the settlement of it, the transactions, they take place over smart contracts, but still these smart contracts or the gateway to these smart contracts is controlled by a certain provider. And then you have really the pure DeFi, which we'll see, or which we saw that is not regulated. There it's really transactions, they take place via smart contracts, and there is not a legal entity that controls them. And yeah, you see, I mean, the degree of decentralization on this slide, you see it increases from left to right, but usually the user friendliness decreases from left to right. So it's very hard to have a completely decentralized setup that is extremely user friendly.
DeFi is basically like playing with wires to access electricity. So if you want to have something super convenient, you need to have like this full stack that was prepared for you, and you just interact with that. If you want to play with the wires and do it like in a very, let's say, bootstrapping model, this is DeFi. You're directly accessing the technology. So now, when do we have DeFi concretely? A service is decentralized where there is no counterparty, at least not a counterparty that's a legal entity. What does it mean? So counterparty on the first side is someone who has control power over the service. You need to have control to have obligations. If I don't control something, I'm not supposed to have obligations related to the specific thing. It's a bit the same debate as what we had regarding online content and like platforms online. The platform doesn't control what you're posting, so they were not supposed to be subject to liability for it. Here it's the same. If I don't control the protocol, why should I be responsible for what the protocol does? So you need a counterparty that controls a service. But that counterparty needs to be a legal entity. And this is where things become complicated, is that you have on one side the golden standard being technical decentralization. So code alone cannot be a counterparty. Code is not a legal entity, it's not an individual, so you can set aside all the issues of MiCA and other regulations because the only counterparty that someone has are just lines of code. If this is not the case because the protocol is somehow controlled, there are some admin functions, there are some dependencies, we can always check whether at least there's decentralization at the governance level. And then you would need to have a decentralized floating community that's also not a legal entity. And as Romedi will explain later, it's not so easy nowadays to have this fully decentralized governance aspect. And then the last layer is what is being controlled? What is the service? Is this do we have a valid contract between this counterparty on a regulated service? Because if I have a community that is not fully decentralized but just decides on some names for specific products or decides to change, I don't know, like a small airdrop campaign, but doesn't really control the core aspects of a regulated service, no one cares. We need to really check what is the relationship between the actual regulated service, the functions that underpin that service, and the centralization points. And yeah, this is the slide that summarizes DeFi. So basically, what is DeFi according to the European regulator? It's the DeFi that makes people scared. So if there's no one in charge, no one controls anything, and you just have this wild beach without anyone being there to save you if something goes wrong, you have actual DeFi. If there's someone to take you by the hand, potentially you may be subject to MiCA because you're a bit too user-friendly.
Right, and then, yeah, you actually have to, as Anne-Grace mentioned, I mean, you have one possibility that you avoid the applicability of MiCA, that is the golden standard if you have really technical decentralization. And that means that your setup has to be such that the smart contracts, they have to be self-executing. That's actually standard on Ethereum, but then they also have to be autonomous. So you don't have to have people or entities that really have the possibility to interact, that have admin keys to do something with this smart contract, adjust it. And then the last one is, even if you have something self-executing and autonomous, if you have embedded some special rights into the contracts, for example, that revenue flows to you, then you might still become subject to the
Maybe
MiCA.
a good example of that is reward distributions. Rewards are distributed on chain. That's great. It's self-executing if specific conditions are met. But if I still need a human to input who gets how much, it doesn't work. It should be a pre-coded logic.
And then the second one, if you realize, well, we're not completely decentralized on a technical side. Actually, we see that often with projects. They would like to be decentralized from technical side, but they see, well, at the beginning, we will not be as of day one. And as Engrace told us, you have to be decentralized as of day one. You cannot say, well, we will do that later. Otherwise, you need the license or be subject to other obligations. But if you see, well, that's not possible, then there is still the possibility to decentralize the governance. And because there the question is, if you have a centralized element, can this centralized element actually be attributed to someone? And that could be you as a project company, so it can be someone, a natural person, or it can be the project company, so a legal person. But it's important to understand that it's also general partnership or simple partnerships that could also fall under it. And there the special question is, what we did in the past is outsource these critical functions from a regulatory perspective, that we outsource that to a DAO, but also there you have to watch out, because the DAO could actually qualify as a simple partnership. We've seen that in the Oki DAO case, where there was a ruling that due to the fact that there were distribution of revenues and governance rights regarding really fundamental questions, and not what Engrace said, you can choose the name of the token or the color of the logo, so really fundamental questions, then you can qualify as a simple partnership. So when you transfer something to a DAO, think about it, how should we structure the DAO so that it doesn't become a simple partnership. And then the second thing is also, I mean, even if the DAO as a whole is not a simple partnership, it can be that specific actors in there become liable for it. So if you or someone as a single person has more than 50% of the governance token, will be responsible for it. If a group together holds more than 50% and they're again considered a simple partnership, they will also be responsible for it. And then, of course, what we often see is that in DAOs that you have these delegates or committees or whatever, the DAO can outsource certain things to these committees and delegates, but they could again become a simple partnership. So you really have to watch out how you structure it, so you're still considered true DeFi and not subject to MiCA.
Yeah. Basically, the more you structure your DAO, the greater chances are that you will not be considered DeFi by me under MiCA, which is kind of contradictory with what this stands and what we were doing until now. And because time is running out, we will wrap up with the MiCA survival tactics. Just at the end of the day, what do you need to keep in mind based on this presentation? First of all, don't be a regulated activity if possible. It's not always possible, but if at least you identify from the beginning that your activity is not regulated, you kind of can feel safe.
Yeah, and the second one, reverse solicitation, you can do that, but again, keep in mind reverse solicitation, that exemption applies only in a very narrow field. Then the technical decentralization, what we discussed, don't have any control, or if you still have control, make sure that it's not you or a legal entity that has control. That would then be the governance decentralization.
So build open source public goods that no one controls, or watch out for MiCA. Thank you very much.
Thank you.